and welcome to your lecture on the development of writing. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Imagine for a moment a world without writing. It would be a world without student notes. You would be expected to simply learn everything that I'm telling you by remembering it. I hope you have a good memory. Without writing, there would be no books, no letters, no text messages, no records of births or marriages or deaths. All history would be oral, that is, passed down from generation to generation in story form. That means that the lives of the great would be immortalized, made legend, and the lives of ordinary people would be completely forgotten. Writing is the most important technology there is for storing information and communicating ideas. It is thanks to writing that I was able to make you that Sumerian bread, because somebody 4,000 years ago decided to write down the recipe. And yet, the earliest forms of storing information came not from a need to write down bread recipes, but a need to track something much more important to the everyday Sumerian, namely, what and how much they owned. Think about it. If you were a farmer thousands of years ago in Sumer and you raised, say, sheep, you have to have some way of recording how many sheep you have. And every time a sheep gives birth, you have to record another sheep somehow. Every time you sell a sheep and now have fewer sheep, or you eat one, or you sacrifice one, now you have to update the tally. How do you do that if you cannot write? The answer that the Sumerians came up with was tokens. Tokens are small pieces of baked clay with pictograms on them. A pictogram is a symbol that represents something else. For example, if you think about a heart, we use that to represent both your physical heart and also the concept of love. Or if you see a sign with a red cross on it while you're driving, you probably know that there's a hospital nearby. An airplane? Well, probably an airport nearby. Those are all pictograms, symbols that represent something else. And they're pretty common. They're very good for sending simple messages. Here's what the tokens look like. Here are some pictures of some actual Mesopotamian tokens made of baked clay. And here you see the pictograms on each one. These pictograms may not look to you like the items are supposed to represent, but if you think about it, it would take a long time to draw a complicated picture of a sheep on hundreds of tiny tokens. So people simply drew a cross instead. Same if they were doing oil. Instead of drawing a complicated oil jug, they simply took a piece of clay, made it approximately the shape of a container of oil, and then drew a little line there to show the lid. So this token here represents oil, and this token here represents a sheep. People use tokens to count the items that they owned, they bought, or they sold. So if, for example, you had 20 sheep, you would also have 20 sheep tokens, one for each of your sheep. Then if you killed a sheep, you could simply take one of those tokens out of your counting pile. If you bought one, you could add one. And if you wanted to send a message to somebody else, such as, I would like you to trade you 2 sheep, you could send along 2 sheep tokens. The need to send along messages using tokens led to another innovation, namely the clay envelope. Because if you were sending a messenger across a long distance in order to do some sort of transaction, you needed a way to keep him honest. And that meant that you wanted to conceal, to hide, exactly how many tokens you were sending and what was on them. So what people would do is they would take tokens and they would seal them in balls of clay. So if, for example, you wanted to send 2 sheep with a messenger to somebody else, you could put 2 of those sheep tokens inside a clay envelope, bake it, give the envelope and the sheep to the messenger, and send them along. When the person who received the sheep met the messenger, then he could simply break open the ball, compare the number of sheep tokens to the number of actual sheep, and understand whether or not that messenger was being honest. Now, eventually somebody figured out that it would be a lot more time efficient in some cases to simply write everything down on one clay tablet instead of making tokens for each individual item. So that if, for example, you were sending 5 sheep and 5 garments to your friend, instead of making 10 different tokens to represent those items, you could simply take one clay tablet and draw 5 pictures of sheep and 5 pictures of garments on it and send that along in your clay envelope. Less work for you, easier to keep track of. Here are some examples of clay tablets. Here are some examples of clay tablets with pictograms on them. And here is where we start to see writing take the next step, because instead of having one concept, one item on each individual token, you have several different concepts, several different items displayed on the same piece of clay. Tokens, envelopes, and tablets were a good start, but they weren't infallible ways to show ownership. After all, anyone could make a token. Anyone could make a clay ball. What anyone couldn't make was a unique cylinder seal. A cylinder seal was an all-in-one seal, signature, stamp of ownership, and piece of jewelry. What a cylinder seal was a small cylinder. Surprisingly, I do mean it when I say small. A small cylinder, and you probably can't see it too well on this camera here, but they were engraved so that when you would roll the cylinder seal across a piece of clay, it would create a unique image. So each cylinder seal was different and would produce an image unique to its owner, so that you knew if a clay ball, a clay envelope, had a cylinder seal image belonging to your friend Joe, that Joe was indeed the one who sealed it and not anybody else. I'm going to give you a better picture of a cylinder seal, since while this is awesome, it probably isn't showing up all that well. Here's an up close and well lighted picture of a cylinder seal. You can see here the engraved image of the picture. And here is what it looks like when the cylinder has been rolled out onto a soft piece of clay. Cylinder seals were used to sign documents, to seal containers, and to put a mark of ownership on items so that people would know to whom they belonged. If you look up here, you can see a little hole. If I put it up here, you might be able to see the hole in the end here too. The way that people would keep track of these tiny little cylinder seals was to put string or a thin strip of leather through the seal and wear it like a necklace or like a pin, so they could wear them as necklaces or pins whenever they went out. So now we have tokens, pictograms, cylinder seals, and people etching out concepts on tablets. We're well on our way to writing, but so far we're still limited to pictures. The earliest writing system that would develop out of those pictograms is called cuneiform. Cuneiform comes from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge. And if you look at the kind of stylus that people would use to etch these images into clay, you can see why. Here is a picture of a Sumerian writing cuneiform in a clay tablet. He uses a stylus made out of a reed, and the end of the reed has been cut into a wedge shape in order to make it easier to draw those symbols in the clay. Remember, cuneus is the Latin word for wedge. So cuneiform, that earliest writing system, is named after the wedge-edged shapes of these reed styluses. Pictograms were great for sending simple messages or expressing simple concepts. That's why we still use them today. As a writing system, they simply don't cut it. And it soon became clear that people needed a standardized writing system that was simpler and more precise than pictograms. I'm going to break that down for you a little bit. Standardized means that everyone does it the same way. So when you have a standardized writing system, that means that the way that Joe writes something down is going to be the same way that Bob or Larry writes that same concept down. The way that Joe draws a sheep is going to be the same way that Bob and Larry draw a sheep, so that everyone isn't squinting over each other's pictures trying to say, is that a sheep or a cloud? Simpler. If you think about having a pictogram for every single item, you can see why you might need a simpler system. For example, take a look at the background in this video. We've got curtains over there, a picture frame, a mirror, a reflection of the curtains. You got a bookshelf, mug, a couple pictures, dresser. I have hair and eyes and ears and earrings. Imagine having a separate picture for every single one of those things. Now imagine having to learn them all. There were thousands of pictograms in ancient Mesopotamia, and those thousands of pictograms made it very difficult to learn how to write. So we need a standardized writing system where everyone does it the same way. We need a simpler writing system, a way to talk about stuff without having to learn thousands and thousands of different pictograms. And we need a more precise writing system, because while pictograms are very good for expressing simple concepts, they're not so great on the complex subjects. How do you draw a picture of love, of justice? How do you use pictures to tell a complicated story? Can you imagine trying to read the Chronicles of Narnia in pictogram format? It would be basically impossible, or at least extremely time-consuming, and you would miss stuff. So we need a writing system where everyone does it the same way, where you don't have to have thousands of pictograms, and where it's precise enough to be able to express abstract concepts and complex stories. Sumerians did eventually create a writing system, cuneiform, that did all those things, but it was not an overnight process. It's not easy to create a standardized, simple, and precise writing system. One of the first steps was using pictures of things that people could draw to represent things that people couldn't. For example, the Sumerian words for arrow and for life sound the same. They're both the word T. Well, an arrow is pretty easy to draw. Life, not so much. So whether they were talking about arrows or they were talking about life, the Sumerians would use the same image for both, and you could figure out which one it was by context. Another step toward a standardized, simple, and precise writing system was combining pictures to express new concepts. For example, if we were to say that this is the pictogram for cow, that every time you see this, you think cow. And if we were to say that this is the pictogram, these are not, by the way, Sumerian pictograms, these are Mrs. Chertudi's pictograms. If we were to say that this is the pictogram for boy, and every time you see this, you think boy, well then, it's a simple step to combine them and get a cowboy. Combining pictures to express new concepts helped the Sumerians express things that were difficult to draw. I would much rather write this than try to draw a detailed image of a cowboy. Pictures. The next big step happened when people stopped using pictures just to represent actual items or concepts and started using them to represent sounds. This made cuneiform a syllabary, which is a writing system in which each symbol represents one syllable of a word. So for example, as you remember, the word for arrow and the word for life sounded the same. And you may also remember that the way they sounded the same was that the word for both was T. In the first step, we had people using the symbol for arrow to also mean life. Now, they also use it for the sound T, so that whenever people see the picture of an arrow, it could mean an arrow, it could mean life, or it simply could be a sound, T. This was revolutionary because it meant that instead of having to have a separate character for every single item in your world, leading to thousands of pictograms and a huge headache when you wanted to learn how to write, instead, you only had to have a number of symbols corresponding to the number of sounds in your language. And while that still might be a lot, not nearly as many as the number of items in your world. It made it also a lot easier to express abstract concepts. If you wanted to talk about justice, for example, you didn't have to hunt through your language until you found a word that sounded like justice but was easier to draw than justice. Instead, you could just take the symbol that sounded like just and the symbol that sounded like tis and put them together, and somebody reading what you're writing could say, oh, justice, we're talking about justice. All of a sudden, you see the number of symbols in frequent use in cuneiform start to diminish, start to shrink, because people are starting to use symbols for sounds instead of for actual objects. By the year 2300 BC, there were only 600 different characters used regularly in cuneiform. So we went from thousands to 600. That makes the language a lot simpler, a lot easier to learn, a lot easier to write, a lot easier to read. Not only was cuneiform a lot easier to learn to read and write, but it was also able to express much more complicated concepts. There was another effect as well. Since the images themselves were no longer used so much for the actual items, but instead for the sounds that they're trying to express, you see the symbols become much simpler and faster to draw. If you take a look at this chart, you can see the evolution from token to eventual cuneiform sign. So here we have your original token for sheep with its cross. Here's the pictograph or pictogram. And you can see evolve as time goes on, so that by the time we get to the Neo-Babylonian era, the cuneiform for sheep looks very little like the original pictogram. You can see the same one for cattle. Here's how it started as a token with the actual pictogram here, and it evolves into this. Still looks a little bit like this. You can see where it came from, but it definitely does not look nearly as much like it as it did in the beginning. Learning to write was a huge step in the path along human progress. The development of writing meant that for the first time, people could record their thoughts, their histories, and their laws, not only for themselves, but as King Ashurbanipal wrote in 600 BC, for the sake of distant days, namely us. See you next week.